A global food collapse does not begin with explosions. It begins with silence, the quiet failure of the systems that feed humanity. Industrial food production is a chain held together by gas-derived nitrogen fertilizers, petroleum-driven mechanization, and cold-chain logistics that must not stop for even a single day. When natural gas shortages cut fertilizer output, global biomass declines on a geometric curve. When oil prices break the transport threshold, the cold chain for meat and dairy fails at the weakest node. When conflict blocks maritime choke points, nations producing less than 30% of their own calories enter immediate scarcity spirals. Biology does not negotiate. Every human requires pattern 600 2,200 kcal per day merely to maintain baseline function. A 20% supply reduction triggers logistic curve violence. A 40% reduction collapses political systems within 90 days. At 60%, mortality follows the combined disease-famine pattern witnessed in Eastern Europe in 1946 and Bengal in 1943. Human survival is governed by 5 physical variables: clean water, accessible energy, population density, self-sustaining food systems, and barriers against mass intrusion. Any region missing even one variable will fail. The modern world is structurally exposed. Over 55% of humanity is urban and dependent on industrial food. Over 70% of the energy required to produce, process, and transport calories comes from oil. Over 80% of international grain flows must pass through narrow maritime corridors. When one link breaks, the entire web loses synchronization. Collapse accelerates faster than any government can respond. The mathematics of survival is merciless. Survival is not determined by intention, optimism, or policy. It is determined by geography. Only 7 regions on Earth possess enough water, energy stability, arable land, climate resilience, and low population pressure to push through the filtration event of a global food collapse. These 7 regions will retain continuity while the rest of the world falls into entropy. Canada and Alaska form the Northern Fortress not because they are comfortable, but because they obey the physics of survival. Cold slows decay. Cold preserves biomass. Cold suppresses pathogen loads that tear through starving populations. When global supply chains break, the regions that already operate with long winters and short agricultural windows possess a structural advantage. They never depended on fragile abundance to begin with. The land teaches restraint. The climate enforces discipline. Collapse hits hardest where expectations of comfort are highest, not where hardship is already normal. Fresh water is the decisive factor. Canada holds nearly 1/5 of the planet's freshwater reserves in lakes, rivers, and glacial systems. Alaska adds deep aquifers and mountain snowpacks that recharge without human intervention. Water determines calories. Calories determine population. Population determines whether order holds or fails. In a global food collapse, fresh water becomes the currency that cannot be forged. Canada and Alaska hold more of it per capita than any industrial region on Earth. Low population density multiplies the advantage. Environmental carrying capacity is a mathematical relationship, land area divided by mouths to feed. When density is low, collapse speed slows. Starvation waves spread thinner. Violence burns with less fuel, and communities can disperse instead of competing in tight clusters. The Northern Fortress has the room to break contact, retreat, and reorganize, something impossible in high-density zones where millions fight over shrinking calories. Historical precedent confirms the pattern. During the Soviet grain crises and post-war shortages, cold storage and northern reserves extended survival windows that warmer regions could not match. The Cold War's deep freeze logistics, massive refrigerated bunkers, silos engineered to withstand power outages, protein stored in sub-zero environments, were modeled after the natural conditions these northern lands already possess. Even without power, meat and grains can survive months longer in these latitudes. The weakness is clear and non-negotiable: short growing seasons. Without industrial machinery, tractors, fuel, fertilizers, the North cannot sustain large populations. Collapse eliminates imports, stranding agriculture at pre-industrial output levels. The operational solution is small-scale, high-efficiency production under controlled environments, greenhouses using passive solar heating, geodesic structures trapping thermal mass, aquaponic cycles converting fish waste to plant nutrients, systems that operate mechanically, not electrically, and exploit the cold as an ally rather than an enemy. Directive: settlements must remain small. Calorie outputs must exceed internal consumption by a measurable margin. Fuel must be rationed for tilling, not transport. Any group exceeding ecological capacity becomes a threat and must be redirected or denied access. The fortress fails only when population exceeds the land's cold-limited productivity. The collapse logic of the North is simple. Cold buys time. Water provides life. Distance limits conflict. In a world starving faster than it can adapt, time is the rarest resource. Canada and Alaska have more of it than almost anywhere else on Earth. Patagonia survives because the world cannot easily reach it. Geography becomes armor when the rest of the planet turns predatory. The region sits behind natural fortifications, glacial fields, broken coastlines, deserts, and the towering Andes. Any mass migration wave loses momentum long before touching its southern edge. In collapse scenarios, isolation is not a disadvantage. It is the decisive variable that prevents population overload, resource stripping, and the social combustion that follows famine. The water advantage is absolute. Patagonia holds one of the densest concentrations of fresh water on Earth. Meltwater rivers from Andean ice, deep glacial lakes, and consistent rainfall carried by Southern Ocean winds. When global food systems fail, water is no longer a commodity but the root of all biological production. Patagonia's hydrology is self-recharging, independent of infrastructure, and immune to long-term drought cycles that devastate equatorial regions. Water produces calories. Calories produce continuity. The land is deceptive. Most outsiders see emptiness, windswept plains, sharp coasts, sparse human presence. But collapse logic does not favor picturesque farmland. It favors low-density terrain with pockets of productive soil. Patagonia's valleys are precisely that: naturally irrigated, volcanic fertilized, shielded by mountains, and distributed in a pattern that is difficult for large hostile groups to exploit efficiently. Small settlements can thrive. Mass movements starve. The historical record shows the pattern clearly. During 20th century trade disruptions, Argentina kept exporting food to Europe even under maritime tension. When blockades cut supply chains, the southern cone maintained enough caloric surplus to support distant nations with millions more mouths. This is the signature of a region whose agricultural backbone scales under pressure rather than collapses. Even when global markets convulsed, Patagonia's pastoral systems, sheep, cattle, cold climate crops, remained stable. Psychology matters. Famine amplifies conflict in crowded societies. Scarcity turns proximity into violence. Patagonia avoids this entirely. Its population density remains among the lowest on the planet. Sparse settlement patterns create natural buffers between communities. When collapse hits, groups can retract, consolidate, and operate defensively without being forced into destructive competition. This is not peace born of cooperation, it is peace born of distance, which is far more reliable. Operational survival in Patagonia follows one rule: exploit decentralization. Food production must be distributed across micro-valleys, not concentrated in large-scale systems vulnerable to sabotage or failure. Livestock must be rotated between grazing zones to prevent overuse. Wind exposure must be weaponized. Strategic siting of shelters, cold wind corridors to limit disease vectors, controlled exposure to reduce insect populations. Every action must convert isolation into advantage. The critical vulnerability is fuel. Heavy machinery, long-distance transport, and modern distribution networks cannot be sustained once global collapse constricts oil supply. Communities must switch to low mechanization agriculture. Draft animals, small plot rotation, cold-resistant crops, gravity-fed irrigation powered by the region's natural slope gradients. Patagonia's terrain supports these methods effortlessly. They are slower but resilient. Distance becomes a defensive perimeter. Scarcity weakens armies. Cold reduces mobility. And rough terrain fractures large groups into manageable fragments. Any mass intrusion breaks apart long before reaching core settlements. The region survives not because it is strong, but because it is unreachable at scale. Patagonia's survival equation is linear: water abundance plus low density plus natural isolation. Extended lifespan in global collapse conditions. In a starving world, distance functions as a barrier thicker than any wall built by human hands. The Andes highlands and the Altiplano form a mountain bastion shaped by altitude, scarcity, and ancient engineering. Survival here is not theoretical. It is encoded into the land. At elevation, the world behaves differently. Disease vectors drop. Spoilage slows. Insects that ravage lowland crops cannot operate in thin, cold air. Famine spreads slower when pathogens lose mobility. Collapse arrives late in the mountains, and that delay is the critical margin that separates continuity from extinction. Altitude creates autonomous water systems. Glacial melt feeds terraces, valleys, and highland basins through gravity alone. No pumps, no grids, no diesel. When the global system fractures, regions requiring no mechanized irrigation outlive those that do. The Andes mastered this logic centuries before industrial society existed. Terraced agriculture allowed the Inca to generate stable caloric output in hostile terrain, storing surplus in elevated silos engineered to stay cool and dry year-round. Modern systems collapse without electricity. Ancient Andean systems function indefinitely. The geometry of the Andes is the true defensive asset. Long, narrow passes control movement. Valleys form natural funnels. Ridges create high-ground dominance that no starving mass migration can penetrate efficiently. In collapse scenarios, geography that restricts movement is worth more than weaponry. A single mountain choke point can deny entry to thousands. A high-altitude settlement sees an approaching threat days before contact. Elevation exposes enemies. It conceals defenders. Food resilience in the Andes follows the rule of diversification. Tubers like potatoes, OCA, and mashua tolerate cold, thin air, and poor soils. Quinoa and amaranth survive in zones where wheat and rice fail instantly. These crops are not luxuries. They are survival genomes shaped by millennia of hard selection. When industrial agriculture breaks, the global seed inventory becomes irrelevant. The crops that survive collapse are the crops that survived prehistory, and the Andes holds one of the largest reservoirs of such species on the planet. Historical verification is absolute. The Inca network endured climatic shifts, prolonged droughts, and supply shocks by storing food in a distributed pattern. Multiple elevations, multiple microclimates, multiple redundancies. When one zone failed, two others compensated. Collapse-resistant architecture existed long before collapse-resistant states. These mountains taught consistency, while the rest of the world learned excess. The weakness is altitude stress. Populations not adapted to thin air lose productivity, strength, and endurance. Starving refugees arriving from lowland regions degrade rapidly. Oxygen deficit alone becomes a barrier against invasion. This is not compassion. This is biology functioning as a defense mechanism. Operational survival in the mountain bastion requires strict organization. Terraces must be maintained, stone channels cleared, seed varieties rotated between microclimates. Storage must be elevated, ventilated, and insulated using stone and dry air rather than powered systems. Herds, llamas, and alpacas must be managed as mobile protein reservoirs, capable of shifting across slope gradients as conditions change. Settlements must never exceed the narrow caloric ceiling that the terrain supports. Above all, the Andes demand population discipline. The land feeds only those who work in alignment with its constraints. If numbers rise beyond carrying capacity, collapse arrives internally, even without external pressure. If numbers remain controlled, the region can outlast every lowland system on the continent. The Andes survive by physics, not luck. Altitude slows disease, gravity provides irrigation, terraces stabilize soil, narrow passes block intrusion, ancient crops require no industrial input. Collapse does not break this region, it merely returns it to the operating conditions it was built for. New Zealand survives because isolation is not a weakness in collapse, it is a shield. The Pacific surrounds it with thousands of kilometers of empty water, a natural moat that no starving mass migration can cross without fuel, coordination, and time. Collapse removes all three. When global systems fracture, distance becomes a defensive wall thicker than concrete. New Zealand's geography denies access to the desperate, the armed, and the contagious. What arrives is minimal. What stays out is everything. The soil is volcanic, loaded with minerals that industrial nations must import through fertilizer. Here, the land regenerates nutrients on its own timetable. Ash flow plains and weathered basalt feed root crops, grasses, and pasture lands without chemical input. Livestock becomes the backbone of caloric independence. Sheep and cattle convert rough, low-quality vegetation into dense protein and fat, resources that require minimal machinery and store far longer than fresh produce. When global food collapse eliminates grain imports and fertilizer, nations with livestock-heavy agricultural profiles survive longer. New Zealand's livestock-to-human ratio is one of the highest on Earth. Maritime climate stabilizes productivity. Temperatures rarely reach lethal extremes. Droughts are shorter, floods are manageable, and frost cycles are not severe enough to wipe out entire harvests. Collapse punishes regions with volatile climates, but New Zealand's environmental rhythm stays predictable even under global disruption. Predictability is survival. The land provides a baseline that does not fluctuate violently when the rest of the planet does. History confirms the pattern. During World War II, New Zealand remained a reliable food exporter despite global naval conflict. Long after many nations rationed calories, New Zealand maintained surplus production. When post-war trade lines stuttered, its internal food systems, pastoral, decentralized, resilient, absorbed shocks without systemic failure. This is not theoretical preparedness, it is a documented ability to remain stable when world markets destabilize. But collapse strips away the hidden dependencies. Fuel imports disappear, machinery breaks with no replacement parts, fertilizer becomes unobtainable. New Zealand's vulnerability lies in this invisible modern layer, a rural system that appears low-tech but is tightly interlinked with global supply chains. Without diesel for transport, without machinery parts for harvest, without synthetic fertilizer for pasture intensification, the nation must revert to older, slower, more sustainable methods. Operational survival demands immediate transition. Fuel must be rationed relentlessly, reserved for essential tilling, emergency transport, medical operations, and coastal defense. Pasture systems must shift toward rotational grazing to reduce fertilizer dependence. Settlements must localize production to minimize transport costs. Protein-dense preservation, smoking, salting, drying, must replace refrigerated storage, which becomes unreliable once power infrastructure destabilizes. The coastline is the decisive boundary. Ports must be controlled, not for trade, but to deny access. In collapse, the greatest threat to island survival is not hunger but intrusion. A single uncontrolled arrival of starving groups can destabilize local carrying capacity instantly. Maritime surveillance, coastal watch stations, and hard interdiction policies become mandatory. Isolation must be enforced, not trusted. Electricity is both strength and liability. Hydropower provides relatively stable energy, but parts for turbines are globally sourced. Small-scale redundant systems, microhydro, wind, off-grid generation, must compensate for industrial decline. Indoor farming powered by local electricity can maintain vegetable supply through winter and buffer against unpredictable harvest shifts. Ultimately, New Zealand survives because it can seal itself off from the world and still generate calories per capita at levels far above collapse thresholds. It does not need to outfight the world. It only needs to outlast it. And an island with water, livestock, stable climate, and natural distance outlasts almost every continental system. Scandinavia and Iceland survive because they possess energy that does not need the world. In collapse, energy independence becomes more valuable than land, armies, or ideology. Nations that cannot generate their own power lose refrigeration, lose water treatment, lose communication, lose agriculture. Nations that can generate power internally rewrite the outcome. Scandinavia and Iceland are two of the only regions on Earth with durable, grid-scale energy that does not depend on oil, gas, or coal. Hydropower is the backbone. Cold rivers, steep gradients, and massive watersheds produce electricity, regardless of global markets. When fuel stops flowing, turbines keep spinning. When shipping halts, dams maintain output. Hydro grants what collapsing nations lose first: refrigeration for food preservation, pressure for water systems, and electricity for controlled environment farming. In a starving world, the region with power can still make calories. Iceland extends this advantage further. Geothermal vents provide heat that never runs out. Industrial society relies on fossil inputs that die within months of collapse. Iceland's heat comes from the Earth's mantle, immune to economic shocks and immune to geopolitical blockades. In a global famine, warmth becomes survival, preventing freezing injuries, enabling year-round indoor growth, and stabilizing biological systems. Most nations freeze when the grid dies. Iceland does not. Protein stability comes from cold seas. North Atlantic fisheries remain among the most productive on the planet. Fish convert oceanic biomass into edible calories more efficiently than land animals. Collapse will cripple mechanized fleets elsewhere, but Scandinavia's proximity to cold water fisheries allows low fuel, nearshore harvesting long after global mechanized systems fail. Protein shortages will kill billions. They will not kill the North. History proves the resilience. Iceland survived the 2008-2011 crash. Its banking system collapsed, currency imploded, imports evaporated, yet the nation did not starve. The reason was structural. Local energy, local fish, and local heat stabilized caloric output even as financial systems died. Scandinavian nations, during multiple 20th century crises, endured prolonged trade interruptions because local hydropower kept production working while other nations shut down. This is collapse-resistant infrastructure, not by design, but by geography. But resilience is not immunity. The weakness is agriculture. Latitude limits daylight. Winters erase natural growing seasons. Without imported fertilizer, northern soils produce modest yields. Indoor growing can compensate, but only if the electrical grid survives. Collapse will test the system. Maintenance parts for turbines, substations, and geothermal pumps come from global supply chains. Once those chains disappear, every broken component becomes a countdown timer. Operational survival demands triage. Energy systems must be defended as primary assets, more important than farmland, more important than government buildings, more important than coastal infrastructure. Any damage to hydroelectric dams or geothermal plants accelerates collapse. Redundant parts must be manufactured locally before global supply chains vanish. Workshops must shift from consumer production to grid preservation. Indoor agriculture must be scaled aggressively. LED efficiency is irrelevant once collapse hits. Any light source powered by local energy becomes acceptable. High-protein crops, peas, beans, leafy greens, must be prioritized over luxury or high-water demand plants. Heat from geothermal systems must be integrated directly into growing chambers to reduce electrical load. Calorie output must be calculated per watt, not per acre. Population must be controlled. Scandinavia and Iceland have enough energy and protein to sustain stable communities, but not enough arable land to absorb massive migration. Borders must harden. Ports must screen or reject arrivals. A single influx of refugees exceeding carrying capacity would destabilize local systems instantly. The region survives only if its population stays within the limits defined by energy, fish stocks, and controlled environment output. Survival in the Nordic core is governed by one equation: energy first, calories second. Energy allows calories to exist. Unlike most regions of the world, Scandinavia and Iceland can produce heat, electricity, and protein without external help. They are not immune to collapse, but they enter it with advantages no other densely developed region possesses. They do not endure because they are wealthy. They endure because their geography continues feeding them after the world stops. Central Asia survives because mobility outperforms scarcity. When a global food collapse tears apart fixed agricultural systems, the regions that depended on static fields and fragile supply lines die first. The steppe does not. Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and the surrounding high plains operate on an ecological model older than industrial society, one that does not require dense irrigation grids, imported fertilizer, or permanent infrastructure. The land feeds animals. Animals feed people. It is a caloric engine that functions even when the world stops. The defining feature is scale. The steppe stretches across thousands of kilometers of grassland with population densities so low that resource competition remains minimal even under stress. Famine spreads like fire in cities because density allows no retreat. The steppe avoids this entirely. Distance acts as a pressure valve. Scarcity distributes itself across enormous space rather than concentrating into explosive conflict zones. Collapse always punishes the crowded. Central Asia is the opposite of crowded. Grazing systems provide a self-renewing protein supply independent of industrial input. Sheep, goats, horses, yaks, and camels convert wild grasses, inedible to humans, into meat, fat, milk, and transport power. This is biological alchemy. While global agriculture depends on nitrogen fertilizers and mechanized harvesters, the steppe relies on herbivores that require neither. A herding economy can degrade, but it does not collapse outright. As long as grass grows and animals move, calories continue. History proves the durability. The Mongol Empire sustained armies across continents using mobile herds, fermented dairy, and preserved meat dried by wind and sun. They required no planted fields, no granaries, no vulnerable supply lines. Even during Soviet famines, nomadic and semi-nomadic populations survived more consistently than urban or agrarian groups because mobility let them outrun ecological failure. Immobility kills. Movement keeps systems alive. The environment further strengthens survival odds. Harsh winters eliminate parasites and disease vectors that explode in temperate agricultural zones. Heat, cold, and wind combine to suppress crop plagues and livestock epidemics that could devastate fixed farms. Collapse introduces biological chaos, rodents, insects, pathogens, but the steppe's climate denies them maximal spread. Survival is not about abundance. It is about suppressing threats long enough to adapt. But the steppe is not invulnerable. Without fuel, modern transport declines. Without antibiotics, animal disease risk increases. Without governance, raiding replaces trade. The region's weakness is fragmentation. Vast land, limited central authority, and long distances between productive zones. When collapse ignites, old patterns return. Clan-based organization, mobile defense, and resource protection by distributed force rather than centralized systems. Operational survival requires reverting to principles that sustain the region for centuries. Herds must be rotated across seasonal pastures to prevent overgrazing. Water sources must be mapped, defended, and rationed during drought years. Salt must be stockpiled because livestock survival depends on it. Trade should be local, limited to safe corridors, and conducted through trusted groups with established reputations. Grain production must be small-scale, focusing on hardy cereals like barley and millet that tolerate the climate. Storage should emphasize dehydration and fermentation, not refrigeration. Defense hinges on mobility. Fixed positions invite encirclement. Mobile groups avoid attrition. Horses remain more reliable than engines when fuel becomes rare. Surveillance must rely on elevated terrain, long sight lines, and predictable choke points along river valleys and mountain passes. Collapse converts attackers into opportunistic foragers. Mobility denies them advantage. The steppe cannot be held in the conventional sense, but it can be inhabited, continuously, flexibly, and defensively. Population pressure must remain minimal. A large influx of refugees from collapsing regions would overwhelm water points and destroy grazing cycles. Borders must be defined by terrain, not ideology. Natural deserts, mountain ridges, and empty plains become filtration layers that only small, self-sufficient groups can cross. Central Asia survives because it is difficult to invade, difficult to traverse, and impossible to exploit at scale without mechanized logistics. The survival equation here is not agricultural, it is kinetic. Grass plus animals plus movement, extra calories. Collapse does not break this system, it reverts it to its historical baseline. When the world fractures under immobility, Central Asia endures by never standing still. The East Africa Rift and the Great Lakes region survive because biology favors the equator, if elevation moderates the heat. In global collapse, climate becomes a mathematical filter. Low latitudes offer sunlight year-round, generating photosynthesis even when the rest of the world enters agricultural winter. But raw equatorial heat kills crops, spreads insects, and accelerates disease. The rift avoids this failure because altitude cools the air while keeping the light. It becomes a rare combination: equatorial energy without equatorial decay. The hydrology is unmatched. The Great Lakes of Africa, Victoria, Tanganyika, Malawi, hold some of the largest bodies of fresh water on the continent. These lakes are deep, insulated, and fed by complex watershed systems that do not depend on industrial management. Water is the master variable of survival. In collapse, regions that rely on engineered reservoirs die when the pumps fail. Regions with gravity-fed, self-regulating lakes outlast them. The rift holds water in volumes large enough to sustain agriculture, livestock, and human consumption for generations, even without modern infrastructure. Volcanic soil is another decisive asset. Rift activity continually renews mineral content, creating farmland that remains productive with minimal external input. When global fertilizer production halts, inevitable in a collapse because nitrogen synthesis is energy intensive, most agricultural zones lose half their yields within a single season. The rift loses far less. Its soil retains fertility through geological cycles, not industrial ones. This is the difference between collapse-sensitive land and collapse-resistant land. Biodiversity provides resilience. The region maintains hundreds of traditional crop varieties: bananas, sorghum, millet, cassava, beans, each adapted to specific microclimates. A monoculture world starves quickly. A diversified system absorbs failure. When pests wipe out one crop, others hold. When drought hits one elevation zone, another remains viable. The rift's agricultural diversity forms a living buffer against systemic collapse, shaped by centuries of subsistence farming rather than industrial-scale production. History reinforces this survival pattern. East African communities endured colonial famines, civil conflict, and prolonged droughts by relying on decentralized food systems, terraced farming, lake fisheries, and hardy indigenous crops. These societies adapted to intermittent scarcity long before industrial supply chains existed. Regions accustomed to abundance collapse first. Regions trained by hardship endure. The threat is population pressure. The rift holds some of the highest fertility rates in the world. Collapse intensifies competition for water, soil, and pasture. Without strict control, even fertile land reaches its limit. Starvation does not occur because resources vanish. It occurs because demand exceeds carrying capacity. In the Great Lakes region, the land can feed many, but not endlessly. Collapse will test the balance ruthlessly. Operational survival requires disciplined decentralization. Food production must shift toward terrace slopes, small irrigation channels, and multi-crop gardens that do not depend on external inputs. Lake fisheries must be managed aggressively. Mesh restrictions, no-take zones, seasonal harvesting, to prevent collapse under sudden demand spikes. Livestock must be controlled by rotating grazing between elevation layers, using volcanic foothills for dry season reserves. Seed banks must be community-based, storing indigenous varieties that outperform imported crops in low-input conditions. Defense follows terrain. The rift is a corridor of mountains, cliffs, and broken ground. Movement is channeled naturally. Settlements on ridgelines can monitor migration flows and resist intrusion. Valleys act as funnels, allowing small defensive forces to control large populations of displaced people. Collapse turns refugees into destabilizing vectors. Survival requires filtering entry based on capacity. Geography assists. The rift is difficult to take by force, easy to defend with minimal resources, and complex enough to slow mass movement. Water must be prioritized above all else. Control of lake access determines long-term viability. Communities that lose their shoreline lose their future. Distribution must follow rigid rules. Drinking first, agriculture second, livestock last. Collapse destroys societies that reverse this order. Ultimately, the Rift and Great Lakes regions survive because they combine three rare traits: altitude that cools the equator, fresh water on a continental scale, and soils that feed humans without external chemicals. Where the world's breadbaskets fail due to climate volatility and industrial dependence, East Africa maintains biological output driven by sunlight, water, and ancient crops. Equatorial light creates energy. Volcanic land creates fertility. Fresh water creates time. In a starving world, time is the ultimate currency, and the Rift owns more of it than almost any region on Earth. A global food collapse is not a single event, but a filtration process. Systems dependent on industrial inputs fail first. Regions tethered to imports shatter under their own population density. Nations built on fragile logistics run out of time before they run out of land. Survival is not determined by ideology, technology, or intent. It is determined by the physical variables that govern calories: water, energy, soil, climate, and population pressure. Only regions with structural biological buffers extend their timeline when the rest of the world shortens theirs. The survival equation reduces everything to a cold constant. Water is non-negotiable. Without it, calories cannot exist. Energy is the multiplier that turns land into food. Remove it, and yields revert to pre-industrial limits instantly. Population density determines whether scarcity becomes violence or merely constraint. Soil defines how long production can continue without fertilizer. Climate sets the speed of decay. Heat accelerates rot. Cold slows it. Altitude suppresses disease. Collapse respects none of the constructs humans built around these variables. It simply matches each region's biological profile against the demands of survival and erases those that fail. The 7 regions that endure: Canada and Alaska, Patagonia, the Andes Highlands, New Zealand, Scandinavia and Iceland, Central Asia, and the East Africa Rift, are not united by culture or governance. They are united by physics. Each possesses a form of redundancy the rest of the world lacks. In the north, cold buys time. In the south, isolation buys distance. Mountains create defensible food pockets. Islands retain calories through controlled borders. Energy-rich nations outlive those that freeze in the dark. Grazing cultures survive because mobility keeps them ahead of scarcity. Equatorial highlands endure because sunlight and altitude maintain biological output year-round. The timeline of collapse is brutal. Urban regions lose stability within weeks once imports stop. Agricultural powerhouses lose efficiency within months once fuel and fertilizer run out. Population-dense zones descend into conflict when caloric supply drops below subsistence thresholds. But the 7 survivor regions degrade slowly. Their resource base is not annihilated by supply chain failure. Their carrying capacity falls gently, not catastrophically. Time becomes their strategic asset. In collapse mathematics, every region competes against entropy. The winner is not the strongest, but the one with the slowest rate of decay. The northern forests, southern plateaus, mountain bastions, volcanic islands, cold seas, endless steppes, and equatorial highlands all share that single trait. They decay slower than the world around them. And in systemic famine, slow decay is indistinguishable from survival. The end state is not extinction, it is contraction. Humanity compresses into pockets defined not by borders, but by biophysics. Civilization shrinks to where calories can still be produced without machines, to where water flows without pumps, to where energy emerges from land rather than fuel. The collapse strips away the illusion of global abundance and reveals the underlying rule. Only regions with surplus ecological time remain stable. The final truth is simple and merciless. Collapse moves faster than recovery. A starving world cannot rebuild at the same speed it disintegrates. The regions that survive are those whose environments delay the breakdown long enough for adaptation to take hold. Geography selects, biology enforces, time decides.